The Epic of Helgard, written by the last Retinue. Long ago, in the beginnings of the Age of Man, a land far from any distant memory of elders and druids, a hero with the name of Helgard was gifted with immense strength by the old gods. He was to lead his people to victory against a dark and evil monstrosity plaguing their home they called the Fairlands. Helgard had long blonde hair and deep hazel eyes, tall and muscular. His posture demanded respect. His newfound strength and wisdom given to him by the gods and fairies made him and his people victorious against the savage foes that laid siege upon their beloved kingdom. In exchange of this immense power, however, Helgard was obliged to be encased in stone to fall into an eternal slumber until he was called on once again to defend his people. Helgard voluntarily stepped into the Cave of Deafening designed for his slumber, and in doing so said farewell to his family and kin. He gazed up into the dim, inviting light that beamed down into the cave, and with sword and shield in hand, he was petrified. Days turned into months, and months turned into years. As the cave used to be populated with druids, elders, and folk that reveled in Helgard's glory, soon the cave became more vacant, and in time all but forgotten. Day by day, the sun and moon shimmered its graceful light on the old hero, but was forgotten amongst the hearths of his kin's homes. Helgard was now a remnant of the past, waiting in his eternal stone sleep until one fateful day. Sleeping Stone. Deep in the Cave of Deafening, a luminous glow began to brighten the stony tomb. Long-lost spirits of the forests and caves congregated to unbind the spell they cast on Helgard years ago. The spirits encircled the statue of Helgard and began to chant mystical words in a low, reverberating tone that filled the cave with presence. Their chants, like a beating drum, shook the very foundation of rock beneath them. Their voices, filled with differing tones of sadness and embrace, began to weaken the stone encasing around Helgard. The spirits, however, were not strong enough to break the old curse, for their powers had lost their potency from lack of worship across the land. They knew that reversing the spell would come at a heavy sacrifice. The burden was theirs to bear. And so they did. Using the last of their essence, they burst the stone from Helgard's body, and in doing so soon dissipated into the air and faded amongst the shadows of the cave. Helgard, in his confusion, let out a loud howl, for he had not breathed air for years. He fell off his stone pedestal, slamming his fingers down to the ground, sword and shield still grasped in his stiff hands. His lungs now filled with muggy air, Helgard felt the moist bedrock amongst his skin. He gathered his strength and lifted himself from the ground. He had lost all recollection of his stone curse, for his mind was foggy. Helgard examined the surroundings of the cave. Being blinded by the small light that illuminated where he once stood for years, he spotted a small corridor and decided to investigate. Helgard began to leave his once stony tomb where he slumbered. He glanced back to see nothing but stillness, unknowingly that the spirits of old have passed on and are now in the hands of their father, the Awoken One. Water was dripping from the top of the corridor's cave as he began his ascent towards the light. Small holes in the sides of the corridor revealed hundreds of caverns full of crystals and quartz. The light from Helgard's shield made them glimmer in beautiful colors of blue and green. Helgard began to remember where he was, his thoughts slowly coming to his mind. He knew that he was a revered hero in the kingdom of the Fairlands, and that his mother and sister lived just a mile from this cave. Becoming excited to embrace his family once more, he was only moments away from the brightened exit. In ecstatic laughter, he sprung out of the cave, still stumbling, looked upon his horizon. Helgard's smile reversed course, and his stomach dropped to the ground, as did his knees, as his legs buckled under the weight of his sight. The sacred forests around him were scorched to blackened ash, and down the hill where he stood laid a crumbling, burned and tarnished village, where Helgard's home now laid barren. As he walked through the smoke that engulfed the road towards his mother's hovel, nothing could be found but dry bones of the dead. The carnage was terrible, for no one had seemed to survive. Helgard dragged his sword and shield amongst the dry dirt as he feared for the fate of his mother and sister. He reached the home of his birth mother, and under the support beams of the roof lay two women who in this state could not be recognizable. Helgard's heart dropped, for he could do nothing but weep for his loss. They are now in the hands of their father, long far from the suffering of this world. Helgard sat outside the entrance of his home looking up to the sun-smoked sky, and with tears in his eyes, began to dig 2 graves in the back of his mother's hovel. Placing personal trinkets into each grave, he respectfully bestowed a peaceful place for the resting bodies of his mother and sister. Helgard spoke his last words to his blood kin to help their souls move on from the land. His fists were clenched as he glared down at the loose soil at his feet. Helgard's heart was filled with despair, and in his emptiness left his once called home. Through the pale forest, Helgard moved across the lifeless plains with the memories of his childhood racing in his mind. He remembered his mother mending his every wound and lovingly watching over his beloved baby sister. The smoke at his back, he saw in the distant horizon an enormous tree line, heading towards the forest of old, which in his time was called the Pale Forest, for its distinct tree bark had a slight pale white hue in the morning sun. He wished to find solace within the thicket. Helgard reminisced of his younger years when he and his companions would practice their sword skills. He entered the forest line, where he disappeared within the dark shade of the thick brush above him. The forest was a place of worship and adventure back when Helgard was growing up, and although he fled here to find solace in his despair, nothing but the opposite started to appear. Helgard felt an ominous presence, like he was being watched from every trunk above him. As paranoia set in, he realized that the rays of light began to dwindle as the thicket of the forest became abundant. He felt more alone now, more than ever. The shadows around him began to move, Helgard now knowing that an evil had possessed the forest. Any peaceful spirits that used to dwell within the forestry fled long ago. He began to swing his sword at the branches, for the small dirt path had been blocked by thorny brambles and thick sap-encased branches. The darkness began to encircle him. A foul, guttural moan was heard in the far distance behind him, becoming louder with every moment. Helgard swung his sword at the brambles, hastening his pace as he went deeper into the depths of the forest. The guttural moan switched to a scream of hatred, lower than any man could ever replicate. He knew now that demons roamed the forest and were out for him. Helgard knew he had to move quickly. Unknowingly, his sword became blunt from the blows against the obstacles in his path. He swung down onto a branch and logged his sword halfway through the wood. He pulled and pulled, but the sword did not budge. The scream behind him became an intense growl. Helgard decided to leave the sword behind in the wood as terror struck his heart. He spotted a distant light, unknowing that it may be a trap. His courage began to falter and sprinted towards his last and only refuge. Helgard looked behind him and saw 2 blackened eyes in the shadows. With arms as long as cranes and claws, as sharp as knives, he was close to the light, and as the growl was behind his ears, he turned around and lifted his shield. The unknown shade struck at Helgard, shattering his shield into pieces. The mighty strike blew Helgard back into the light he was so desperately sprinting towards and out of the darkness. He landed into a well-nourished, lush grove. With a light green fog and flowers of all diverse colors surrounding the clearing, the feelings of dread and terror were gone. For he had found refuge in the Pale Forest's sacred grove, one of the last sanctuaries for the old fairy spirits. And within this grove was a small, dark-wooded cottage, which smoke was calmly flowing from the chimney. A man sitting on a crooked chair was looking over at Helgard, as he was still dazed by his own relief. Helgard got on his feet and approached the man, who was not known at first, but soon realized that it was the Hermit of Pale Forest. The Hermit had a long, thick salt and pepper beard, wearing a mahogany brown robe and a large hood over his face. The Hermit was an introverted old law master who used his ancient Zither to communicate to people rather than talking, for he was not fond of speech. He played his Zither calmly, and Helgard approached the Hermit's abode, entering the cottage where a hot pot of tea was waiting for them inside. In the days of old, the Hermit sipped his tea and began to play his Zither. Knowing of Helgard and the quest that was bestowed upon him in these dire times, the Hermit began to tell the story of their people after Helgard's stone encasement. The people of the Fairlands saw a new age of prosperity and peace after achieving victory from their most terrible foe. In this age, great music was created, songs that could only be orchestrated by the help of the great divinity. Art was commissioned that faithfully reflected the beauty of the heavens and was adorned across the land. The armies were strong, daunting men clad in silver-laced armor, and women that gracefully strolled the safe and bountiful meadows that filled the Fairlands with growth and love. The food was plentiful, and the rivers and lochs had pure water that glimmered like diamonds in the morning sun. The mountains stood taller than ever, and the wheat grew large and plentiful. The kings in this age were wise, full of stoic demeanor that strived towards bettering the land and their kin. They praised and worshipped their fallen, their heroes, their gods, and the spirits of the forest. For at this age in the kingdom's history, they knew no horizon far from reach. Dozens of monuments were built in their honor of their own. Sacred groves across the land were being cared for under the supervision of wise and old druids who taught the youngest of the tales of their forebears. All who roamed the lands were in awe of the sheer magnitude of achievement the kin of the Fairlands bestowed upon themselves. As they revelled in their majestic lands, it was as if the fairy tale was over. Peace was everlasting. The Hermit played this song with great passion, for he remembers the days of old when glory was filled within the very hearts of every man, woman, and child. He was a vital elder who watched over the sacred grove of the pale forest, and in his last strung string, he smiled as the thought of this time had an imprint that would never be forgotten. The passing of a kin. The Hermit tuned his zither, having a somber, stressed face, as he began to string another tune. Helgard was given a vision of what preceded after the golden age of their kin. In the coming years there were no adverse challenges given to their kin, and in this extended time they began to forget the virtues that cultivated their once-earned glory. The men began to be lazy, fat with wine and lack of prowess. The women cared more about the luxuries of jewels and silk rather than the proper etiquette of nurturing strong sons and daughters. And so, as the people became weaker, the courts of lesser lords became packed with vipers with slick tongues and daggers in their smiles. The lesser lords began to quarrel over petty differences, starting as a tare, turned into deep-seated grievances. War was on the horizon. Brother against brother, the land was shattered between lords fighting for the high crown. The war was devastating. Fields were filled with bodies of once honorable and valiant men. The children and women starved by the burning fields of wheat that once stood tall and proud. Men of all ages were conscripted and thus sent to the slaughterhouse. The promises of these vipers led great men into the darkness, and in their greed would rather burn the kingdom to ashes than concede defeat. Many attempts of peace were made, but the lords now could not turn back. Fires raged across the land. Droves of families had to flee to distant lands to avoid total annihilation by the power-thirsty lords. Prosperous villages soon became graveyards, the wild and beautiful plains now abandoned. The souls of the grazing cattle that once filled the land with milk and meat were nowhere in sight. The kingdom soon was weak, and the lesser lords were assassinated by their treacherous consultants. In the same fashion even, these traitors betrayed their own until there was one left standing upon the ashes. Sarilok, who became possessed by a demon, reaped the powers of dark sorcery and magic, raising an army of disfigured abominations to do his evil bidding, and so the kingdom plunged into eternal darkness. The dead lay still. Helgard watched the flames dance in the roaring fire in the Hermit's vision, and soon reflected the little fire that kept them and their tea warm in the cottage refuge. All had been lost. Tears of guilt ran down Helgard's face as his stone expression was still. Helgard felt cold as ice. The spirits outside the cottage began to sing in sorrow for the dead that still lay still out in the fields of their once beautiful homeland. The serenade of their voices reminisced on the age of peace that felt so far in this dark hour. They sang, for it seemed to Helgard and the Hermit, for an eternity, and in their minds remembered all that they loved and cherished, the memories of Helgard's childhood into manhood. His glory days as a skilled commander and tactician ran through his mind. The hermit was given visions of speaking amongst the gods, and his moment when the divinity accompanied him. For both Helgard and the hermit, the song of the spirits of the pale forest filled them with determination and hope. Soon their visions became engulfed in the black abyss, for the power of Saralok's dark sorcery that paraded across the land did not allow such hope to be expressed, or even thought, in the minds of his subjects. Although hope had faded just for a moment, the memories of the fallen gave the hermit clairvoyance, and in his epiphany stood up from his rickety chair to open the stiff, thick window panel behind him. Pointing out the window towards a gargantuan spear-shaped mountain far in the distance, the hermit said, "Go." Helgard looked at the mountain, and from the distance could hear a faint father-like voice calling his name. For Helgard was weak in the heart. He knew that he must overcome. He must find his courage once again. Find your courage. Saying goodbye to the hermit, for he had become a dear friend in their time of refuge together, Helgard trekked to the mountain after traversing through the forest after sunrise. He now stood at the base of this giant of a mountain. It was called the Tempest Mountain, for God could be heard mocking the storms that dare pass by, often magnifying the thunder's mighty crackling. As Helgard heard the distant call from the peaks, he grabbed at the first rock and began to climb. With his bare hands he grabbed rock after rock. Inch by inch he soon touched the snow that laid forever on the mountainside. The wind began to pick up. The howls could be heard like roaring horns, vibrating in his ears. The feeling of ice on his fingers made him falter, but only for a moment, for he knew that without reaching the peak, he would do nothing but fail his kin. Helgard climbed diligently, breathing and hoofing a rhyme's pace, a tactic he used to bolster morale in his late armies many years ago. The higher Helgard climbed, the more intense the weather got, until he was in a ravenous snowstorm. The bitter cold pierced through him. Every gust of wind rattling his bones pushed his body sideways, advocating him to lose balance and fall. Helgard looked down and could not see the height of his body, for he lay dangling in the clouds, grasping so hard to the rock that his fingers began to bleed. As fear began to set in, Helgard closed his eyes and dangled still. He heard his god speak out to him. The voice was closer now than before. This filled his heart with a raging fire, like throwing coal into a blistering furnace. Helgard opened his eyes and climbed with unwavering determination. His hair flew freely in the icy winds, his light armor now soaked with water, adding to the weight of his body, yet he trudged on further. His eyes were blinded by ravenous snow, but kept feeling for the next stepping stone to the end of his journey. Helgard soon fell to flat surface, and in his exhausted last breath he pulled himself to the tip of the mountain peak. Helgard opened his eyes to find a monster of a man who, to his disbelief, was transparent, for he could see the clouds of the world behind him. The god who stood before him spoke in a low, scratchy, hum-like tone. His eyes blue as pale ice, standing at 8 feet tall and built brawny like the mountain they both stood on. The god spoke of a sword known as Palentius, which is said to have a shard of the divinity placed in the base of the hilt. Its light is known to pierce through the abyss with righteous fury. The resting place for the sword is at the altar of divinity, in a cave far in the northern reaches of the Fairlands, said to be the place where Tare, the god of light, embraced the world with her immaculate glow. Helgard accepted this task, and the god of the Tempest Mountain turned to icy vapor and rested within the mountain's pass. To distant lands. Helgard's quest was a daunting one, for the Fairlands were not safe as they once were. The lands were filled with traps, monsters, and adversaries alike. Once Helgard descended from the mountain pass towards the northern regions of the Fairlands. He landed in a field where he would in turn tame a wild horse, a chestnut mare he would name Eodorn. Helgard prayed to the gods of the land and the holy divinity, asking for safe passage and courage for his journey. Helgard first traversed through the mighty plains that stretched for miles on end. The mountain ranges graced the sides of the plains with enchanting views. The grass flowed freely in the wind. Day turned to night and night into day. Helgard, through his adventure across the land, would encounter caravans of his surviving kin, telling the tales of his quest, asking for aid. His inspirational endeavors instilled hope back to those who have fallen into despair and apathy, telling them to fight or forever be forgotten in the chapters of time. Helgard, in his journey, became known as the Chosen Rider, the one to follow into Hellfire, for he was chosen by the divinity to rescue them from their impending doom. At nights he would curl close to the fire, often resting within the woods scattered across the land alongside his steed Eodorn, and in his thoughts would think of his close friend, the Hermit, recollecting the calm, relieving sound of his zither, which was the ancient instrument of his kin. He became more determined now than ever. Helgard would soon reach the far northern coasts, where he would reach a small fishing village, asking for a boat to traverse across the vast seas to the altar of divinity. In the telling of his story, the elder of the village gave him the dock's largest ship, provisions, and in turn sent messages to the last surviving outposts of their kin to tell of the coming of the Chosen Rider. Helgard sailed on a long boat, and with the monstrous waves crashing along the hull of each side, Helgard strengthened his resolve and set his eyes north. The waters were treacherous, however he endured them, for Helgard knew that no sorcery or magic would stray him from his path of destiny. The days were long and the nights were longer, often unknowing of what lay ahead of him from the dense fog and storms that raged. He soon saw light blue rays in the sky like galaxies. He had made the trek to Tare's home, where the sword Palentius laid waiting. He strung the boat on a large tree and stepped into the harsh ice snow that laid across this uncharted landmass. The fog dissipated, and in his view was a large crystal-like castle that illuminated hues of white and blue. Sharp and masterfully created, Helgard was in awe, for this palace was contrived for the divinity. Answer the call. Helgard pushed open the icy doors, and although the breeze outside was cold, the doors felt warm to the touch. He entered a circular room furnished with tables, chairs, and crystal sculptures. The silence was still inside the palace-like space. 4 pillars stood tall in the middle of the room, which he walked through in awe. The intricate designs crafted onto the pillars was masterful and portrayed the history of the people of the Fairlands, like a royally weaved tapestry depicting a dynasty, including Helgard's victory over the darkness that plagued the lands several decades ago. A green door to the side of Helgard soon sprung open on its own. Startling the hero, he saw a twinkling light in the shadows of the doorway. A voice calling for him through the corridor, he entered it. The door soon shut, and the halls of this corridor were lit by torches that emitted a dark blue flame. Helgard, with unfaltering courage, trekked forward until the hallway ended, and he entered an amphitheater. Helgard, standing at the bottom of this theater, looked up at what was emitting the glowing light, and he saw it, the altar of divinity. Levitating above its pure white reflective surface was Palentius. The sword, so close to Helgard's grasp, examined the amphitheater. The stairs up to the altar of divinity were those used by giants, but Helgard was not deterred. He looked upon the monstrous steps and began to climb. Helgard, entering the aura of the divinity, caused his hair to be blown away, for the gusts of wind began to pick up and fly against him. Stair by stair, the wind grew stronger, and a voice calling out for him began to be heard. One voice turned into 2, 4, then 12. The gods, one by one, now behind Helgard as he ascended the stairs of giants. Helgard, pulling himself up the last stair, was now eye to eye with Palentius. Its blade was sharp and transparent white. The blue hilt had a triangle emerald above the handle that illuminated the essence of life and creation itself. Suddenly, the wind circled around Helgard, culminating into a massive ball of force. It exploded out from him. The room was still, and the sound was silent. Small shards of crystal glided through the air as an angelic ball of light consumed Helgard. Time in this moment froze. The sword spoke. In a motherly, calm voice, Tare spoke to Helgard. "Pick up the sword, my warrior of old. Your hand will be guided by my fury. Return to your land you once called home. For your fathers and kin, answer the call." Helgard slowly grabbed Palentius. Immediately he felt the power of the divinity rush through his veins. for he was the chosen hero to return the kingdom of the Fairlands back to its age of prosperity and peace. The power within him grew, and the aura of the divinity surrounded him. Helgard, looking down the stairs of giants, he lifted the sword's tip to the sky and roared. His voice reverberated throughout Thare's castle. Within the entrance room between the four pillars, a massive blue ray of energy was charging, and in a moment's notice blasted like a hurricane up to the sky. Reaching up to the stratosphere, the kingdom of the Fairlands was illuminated by the deep blue waves of light. The kin of the Fairlands saw this as a message, and in their deep despair stood up in defiance. They would fight, for their hero had returned. In droves, the last free people of the Fairlands flocked to the blue light that now wisped above the skies freely. Although the kin of the Fairlands at last had found hope, Sarilok and the forces of evil sought to destroy all who did not submit to this twisted, cruel rule. And in response amassed the largest force of monsters, abominations and corrupted souls he had at his grasp. For the fate of the Fairlands would be decided before nightfall tomorrow. For the Fairlands. Helgard sailed back to the mainland of the Fairlands, and in his arrival was welcomed by the full force of his kin's army. People of all ages gathered at the shore, clad in makeshift armor of leather, mail and plate, and brandished swords, axes and mighty hammers. The call had been answered. The warriors roared as Helgard, mounted on Eodorn, stepped on land and rejoiced in his return. Helgard tallied his warriors. At 12,000 strong, they marched towards the darkening storm clouds that lay far in the distance, for Sarilok was approaching. Helgard quickly surveyed the land outside the fishing village and stationed his army atop a hill where it overlooked a flat valley that stretched for miles. The wind began to change from a weak breeze to a howling screech. The sun began to be blocked by the clouds that had a dark green hue within its mass. The deer and birds that laid content in the field below began to flee and disappeared within sight, for the forces of evil had arrived. Their stench, like a decaying carcass, could be smelled from across the field. A putrid taste could be felt in the mouths of the Fairlandians. The dark forces had degrading black armor and weapons of rust and oxidized iron. They panted like rabid dogs and had sunken eyes with no life behind their pupils. Occasional screams could be heard from within Sarilok's ranks. Their low battle drums could be heard beating, vibrating the very earth beneath Helgard and his kin. Their black war horns were heard with a guttural cry that sounded torturous to the ears. As the army approached like a black tsunami across the land, Helgard realized that they were outnumbered 5 to 1. Looking to his army, he saw fear in their eyes, for morale was at a breaking point. In Helgard's defiance, he rode to the front of his army and unsheathed Palentius and lifted it high above him. Helgard had to rally his men, and using the power of the divinity, roared so all could hear his commanding words, "My brothers in arms, my maidens of steel, my God who watches down on us from the heavens. Never again shall we hide in the shadows of our shame, giving up the very land our ancestors tamed for the betterment of their descendants. Never again shall our children watch as fear strikes our hearts and eyes, leaving nothing but loss and despair within their own. Never again shall we break our kinship with one another, and leave our own blood soiled and stepped on by the powers that be. We are given this chance, this one moment in time, that all who will hear of our triumph over impossible odds will echo through the echelons of history, not only in the Fairlands but distant lands never seen. For our sons and daughters will hear of our deeds and look upon our broken swords and shields with pride, pride for their mothers and fathers, pride for the very land that is soaked in our blood. Today we are not farmers or fishermen, nor are we vagabonds in our own land, nor traitors to our own. Today we are warriors, today we are free. So follow me, my brothers in arms, follow me, my maidens of steel, follow me to victory." In that moment, a horn from the back line of soldiers was blown. The speech rallied the warriors and made them burst into a frenzied hurrah. They began to charge down the hill onto the advancing hordes of darkness. Helgard, leading the charge on his horse, was reinforced by the cavalry that functioned as the vanguard. The Fairlandians were in full charge. Helgard, with Palentius raised in front of him, illuminated a path of light into the abyss that engulfed the hordes of evil. The cavalry, closing in on Sarilok's front line, lowered their lances and smashed the enemy forces. The battle for the Fairlands had begun. The cavalry cut through the lines and slayed hundreds by the sheer weight of their speed and mass. The mounted knights dropped their lances and swung their swords as they were now stalled in motion from the number of foes around them. The warriors on foot caught up to the cavalry and reinforced their position, allowing for the cavalry to escape and charge once again on the flanks. Helgard galloped through his forces, giving commands and slaying enemy after enemy. Helgard, surrounded by his fellow kin, dismounted Eodorn and led a secondary charge, pushing deep into the horde. The battle was brutal. Each warrior of the Fairlands had 4 to fight. The odds were becoming less and less in their favor, as the hordes of darkness were rallied by the emergence of Sarilok's banner. They continued to fight through the ranks of ghastly ghouls and decaying soldiers of evil, and although thousands of them fell, Helgard's army was dwindling and hope was beginning to fade. Sarilok appeared to fight Helgard, for Helgard now was wounded by a spear in the leg and an arrow in his arm. Sarilok, using his staff as a heavy mace, beat down on Helgard. Blocking with Palentius, he buckled and tripped to the ground. Helgard blocked his strikes the best he could, but Sarilok's strikes were menacing. In a last mighty blow, Sarilok slammed his staff onto Helgard's Palentius, and the sword shattered into pieces. Time stopped. Nothing could be heard or seen. Helgard was sitting on the battlefield, but all was gone. Total darkness surrounded him. Far in the dark abyss that Helgard was trapped inside of, a beautiful angel approached Helgard. The light from her aura was so bright that the only distinctive feature he could discern was the long, flowing white hair that she graced his eyes with. Helgard sat looking up, and tears ran down his cheek in her elegance. She spoke in a calm, motherly tone. "Get up, my son, for I am your mother. My unrelenting love shines bright in you. Pick up your sword, my warrior of old, and break the chains that bind you still." Helgard, laying on the battlefield still, opened his eyes and glanced over at Palentius. The sword began to reform from its shattered state and started to glow radiantly. Helgard stood up and grabbed the sword, roaring at Sarilok as he walked away. Sarilok, unaware of Helgard's advance, looked over in confusion. In that moment, Palentius pierced his chest through his black silk robes, stabbing his heart. The tip of Palentius could be seen behind him. Helgard pulled the sword back. Sarilok yelped in terror and fell to his knees, looking at the wound in horror. Helgard grabbed the handle with both hands and yelled as he swung, chopping the head off the sorcerer. Sarilok's body fell back, and black ooze seeped from his wounds into the ground. His minions saw their master fall and see his body decay into a grotesque, slimy husk. Sarilok's body in a moment exploded. Black dust exited his body and elevated into the air violently. Helgard saw the black energy cultivate high in the sky and soon faded away. The dark clouds began to dissipate. The sun beamed down like a broken dam and graced Helgard with its warmth. His armor shined like a star. His hair flowed against the wind. Helgard raised Palentius high in the air and shouted at his kin to charge. The minions of Sarilok were routed. They screamed in fear and scurried away from the sun as they were cut down by the remaining Fairlandian cavalry. Helgard glanced back at his soldiers, and as every one of them had battle scars, they rejoiced in their victory. Praising their hero Helgard, they surrounded him and unanimously crowned him king of the Fairlands. On that fateful day, Helgard and his kin were freed from the shackles of darkness and corruption. A new age of prosperity and peace were upon the Fairlandians, and soon they began to rebuild their once beautiful kingdom. Helgard's memory was commemorated with a marble statue that laid bare in those fields that day they were victorious against the army of darkness. Forever will Helgard be remembered by his people, for his valor, his strength, his tenacity and courage. For the love he felt for his people was unbreakable, and nothing, not even death, could deter Helgard from his God-given destiny. The sunset rested on Helgard's face as Eodorn fed on the grass in the surrounding plains. Palentius was placed in the ground and lay dormant next to Helgard the Fair. He looked upon the land in front of him and felt a soft hand against his shoulder. Helgard, curious of this presence, looked to his left. There was nothing but his beautiful kingdom in front of him. Helgard nodded and smiled. He looked upon the hue of soft orange and purple far in the distance, and in that moment the horizon felt closer than before.